One wonders if the winds were blowing the day Judge Cornelius Hanford platted the town that would bear his name. Did he give much consideration to the future of this little farming community nestled in the dry and open environment of the Columbia Basin? Or was it just another source of customers for his Hanford Irrigation and Power Company? How could he have known that this closely knit community would rise to 51,000 people and then, only 18 months later, become an abandoned remnant of what was? Prior to 1942, the small towns of Hanford, White Bluffs, and Richland Village found their prosperity in the rich volcanic soils of the Columbia Basin. Orchards and farms stretched along the shores of the Columbia River. Family life was securely rooted within the communities.
Wonderful. I couldn't think of a greater place to grow up, and all my friends say the same thing. We swam, we rode horseback, we climbed Mount Gable.
And horseback riding, jackrabbit hunting, and, you know, just normal things that kids do when they're that young. Our parents would take us to the Grange dances on the weekends, and of course they played cards, and, you know, they always took their children with them. They didn't leave them home. Babysitters were out of the question.
We just had fun. We didn't have money, and of course we lived through the Depression in the 1930s, and we were just getting out of the throes of the Depression. When the government came in and took our land, things would have been different.
But the winds of change were on the horizon. It was December 2nd, 1942. Only a year earlier, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had plunged the United States into war. An elite group of scientists embarked on a secret mission called the Manhattan Project, a project to construct the world's first nuclear bomb. In order to make plutonium for the weapon, the government needed an isolated location, vast amounts of land, and a clean, abundant supply of water. When Lieutenant Colonel Franklin Matthias flew over the Columbia Basin, he found what he was looking for.
Back in Chicago, they had the first chain reaction, and Fermi was there, and 3 months and 4 days later they were in our town of Hanford, and we were told we had to leave. Of course, they had come out there unknown to a lot of us. The government men that came out, we didn't see them, and I kept thinking, oh heavens, they've discovered oil or uranium or something in our back of our place, west of our ranch, because they were digging, and we thought, oh heavens, we'll be rich yet. But we didn't know that this was all transpiring.
Well, the people they just had to leave. Some were offered jobs, and some of the personal accounts are that they felt guilty when they accepted a job because there was a lot of very real antagonism, and it still remains. And people I've talked to today, whose parents were there and they were high school students at the time, still have a resentment against the way they were treated.
We all lost each other. Basically, we lost each other. And then, of course, all the young men, you know, went into the service.
There's some accounts that are rather, I guess we would say in retrospect, a bit irritating, that there was nothing there, just a few farmers, one church, and that sort of thing. That's not true. There were farmers just beginning to get on their feet, as a lot of farmers were at that time, and their whole life was completely disrupted.
Do I call it home? Well, yes, I think so. I think so.
The decision was made. The Columbia Basin would be a vital part of the war effort. Families moved out and the government moved in. As Camp Hanford grew from the abandoned towns, trailers came by the thousands, and tar paper barracks rose overnight to house construction workers recruited from around the nation.
But they couldn't tell us anything about Hanford. Nobody knew anything about it except that it was a war project.
When we arrived here, something like 1 a.m., it was a long train, and so they stopped and we all had to get off. And they were there to meet us, and they're running all through all these crowds getting off of the train when saying, operations or construction, operation or construction. I mean, you know, no one had that name, but it sounded like it.
There was 3 of us drove from Helena, Montana in a car, and we said if they'll hire all 3 of us, we're going to stay. Otherwise, we'll get back in the car and drive home. Well, they wanted people real bad, so they hired all 3 of us.
Dad was making big money, but missing the family, and thought he saw a future in the Northwest. We received the directions: sell the farm, buy a trailer house, and come to Washington. We left Springfield, Missouri, driving a 1937 Pontiac 4-door sedan and pulling a 25-foot American trailer house. We had 13 flat tires between Springfield and Cheyenne, Wyoming. When we reached Cheyenne, Mom went to the local ration board to see about some decent tires. When they heard that we were on our way to Hanford, we were immediately authorized to purchase 4 new Grade A tires. All you could buy otherwise were 2-ply recaps. Those new tires saw us safely to Hanford. Our trailer had a sign on it that read, "Hanford or Bust." Recollections from Robert Harmon.
They were having major problems keeping employees, particularly women employees. It was such a horrible place to live. And no one would stay. And they had invested a great deal of money to hire people on the East Coast or anywhere they could find them to come out here. And people thought they were going to the great green Northwest. And they came here and found desert and dirt and dust and heat. It was hot. It was over 100 degrees. There was no air conditioning. And the wind blew and the dirt blew because they had a lot of land torn up.
The stories are that a lot of people came and rode a bus to the site and got on the same bus going back to Pasco and didn't stay. Something over 120,000 people passed through the area as part of the construction.
We were met by the greeters of DuPont, which they had at the station, and they brought us over here then in a cattle car.
Well, transportation from Richland to Hanford was only in an old bus, or what we used to call a cattle car. And the one I went up in was a cattle car. Now, a cattle car is just like an enormous bus, except the seats are all run on the exterior, everybody's facing the center. But they call them a cattle car.
And my mother said, "You must come up here and work this summer." And I said, "Why? I already have a summer job here." "No, you must come up from Corvallis and have this once-in-a-lifetime experience." Thank goodness it was only once.
I was in the barracks, but the barracks were so small, it was like being in a closet.
Primitive. The women's barracks were just rattly barns and no air conditioning, of course. If you wanted some air, you opened the window and let the wind and the dirt and everything blow in.
Well, the ads in the National Geographic prior 1940 magazines, National Geographic magazine prior to 1940, have ads for the type of trailers that they were living in out there. They were advertised, I think it was Schultz trailers, they were advertised for weekend use. They were not expected to live in for long term. Very thin walls, little or no insulation, no indoor water in most of them.
And you're making this great money. And that's why, and the only reason people stayed here, because they were making money. There was no place to spend it, so I guess the bank did pretty well.
The lack of amenities abound, but it was to be the Columbia Basin environment that would cause the growing population the most trauma.
The wind blew so much around here, and it was so aggravating for the people in construction out working, because the sand and dirt was blowing all over them while they were trying to do a job. But they got to call on those winds then, termination winds. And some of the construction people would say, well, it was E.I. DuPont, but from now on, it's just E. DuPont because I is leaving.
On Fridays, when the wind blew, we had we had all these resignations, so we were busy getting their checks and whatever else ready for them so they could take off as fast as they could get out of there. And that would have been nice. I lots of times thought I might do that, but then my husband didn't want to, so I didn't either.
Before streets, grass, or trees, when the termination winds would blow, my mother served our meals in the pots with the lids on and our plates turned upside down. After saying grace, we would then turn the plates over when it came your turn to dish up. There was no need for pepper because you never knew how much to put on with all that dirt moving through the house. Recollections from Jim Brasina.
Our first house was a single-bedroom prefab, and boy, it was really something. No lawn, no nothing, crack under the door about a ½ inch wide and so forth, but we survived it rather nicely.
Everybody had a lettered house. I think ours was a Y, one of the ranch houses. There were 1,000 of them all alike, and if you were coming home late at night, you wanted to be sure you got the right one.
As the first houses were built in Richland, the B houses and F houses were all the same, with the same furniture for each house. We were assigned the first house on Farrow Lane. There were 2 B houses side by side. My dad worked with a man who lived in the second B house on the same side we lived in. About a week after we moved in, my mom heard the front door close and the closet opened for someone to hang up a jacket. She thought it was my dad, and they were carrying on a conversation with yes and no answers. She went into the living room to give my dad a kiss, and it was the neighbor man. For 2 months he repeated coming into our house, and only recognized he was in the wrong house when one of us appeared. Plants were hard to come by then, and Mother arranged to find a flower pot and put it on the front step. This let him know he was at the wrong house. Recollections by Geneva Hammer.
It was a benevolent despotism on the part of the government. They did everything for you, but they required that you toe the line and do the things that they wanted. And it's true, if you wanted to, they would come out and change a light bulb for you, but people didn't ask for that kind of service. But they did maintain everything. They painted the houses. They took care of everything.
In the spring of 1944, Camp Hanford was abandoned as the project went critical. The once sleepy community of Richland Village had now transformed into the 4th largest city in the state. The government built houses, shops, and offices lined the once barren landscape, but life in the community was far from ordinary as the code of silence echoed through the town.
People today do not understand the war feeling, the realization that something going on in Hanford was really significant, and there was a strong feeling that we were the workers back home to help the whole situation along. And it was a pretty serious thing. We never talked about that at all, and I don't think people quite understand that, but this was the war effort.
If you didn't have to say anything, you didn't. You know, it was just a matter of a way of life.
The real emphasis was keep your mouth shut and don't talk about what you do.
Secrecy was accepted, and that's just the way it was.
One of my first assignments was lecturing to employees entering the first secured reactor area on the need to keep mum about the work on this vital secret defense work. I, of course, had no idea what the secret was that I was admonishing them to keep. Recollections from George Barr.
And of course, you'd go to a movie, there would be a big sign on the screen, silence means security.
We didn't know what to talk about. We didn't know what we were doing. Had no clues what we were doing, except there was an enormous lot of concrete being poured.
Matter of fact, there's a lot of rumors what was made at the plant, and this is a little sidelight. Apparently there was a show and tell at one of the schools, and one of the kids said, I know what they're making at Hanford, and she said, what are they making? She said, toilet paper. And she says, how do you know that? He says, my dad brings home 2 rolls of toilet paper in his lunch bucket every day.
I remember going to school at the old Hanford School on half-day shifts because there were too many students and lack of space and teachers. And the day our teacher promised no tests if we would just help her find her lost security badge. Recollections by Virginia Poe Morrison.
And we didn't talk about reactors, we talked about a pile or the unit. And we didn't talk about plutonium, we talked about the product. Everything had a code name. The separations activities carried out in the 200 areas. And this is the way the whole plant was set up.
Putting the test reactor in the 305 building required a lot of planning, not only in the design but also the procurement of the fuel rods. It was necessary to maintain the secrecy of the contents of the shipments. Special railroad cars were designed with false floorboards. The rods were stowed under the false floor, and the floor was covered with hay and loaded with horses. When the train arrived at the 300 area, the cars were opened and the horses released. Then, under the security of night, a crew would carefully remove the rods. Because of the massive area of the Hanford project, the arrival of horses did not create any particular interest. It was an accepted fact that the government does strange things, and perhaps because of the known shortage of beef, the government was going to graze the horses on the land and build a slaughtering plant next to the ice house at the original Hanford town site. Recollections by Fran Oskowicz.
Nowadays, it's a different story. We could never, ever have accomplished what they did at that time. Given the restrictions we have now, it never would have happened. Not the way it did at the 1943, 1945.
In the darkness of a desert morning, on July 16, 1945, the atomic age is born. Thunderbolt gives a preview of its destructive force.
Great patriotism, just tremendous patriotism, because they said it's going to help the war effort.
But no, we won the war, and believe me, if we had not developed this bomb ourselves, we would never know free land that we've known, and I think all young people should realize that.
And I think people were much more trusting of the government back then than they do now. It was, you felt that they were trying to do the right thing, and that we were working towards a good end.
The war to end all wars was over. What to do with this desert community that had been created? Nuclear technology was now real. With continued tensions throughout the world and a country looking for new forms of power generation, Hanford would live on. Homes were lost and families displaced, but history had been written, and the once quiet Columbia Basin would never be the same.
You had no family here, so your friends were sort of your family. I know my son has said that many times. There were some of our friends whose children he grew up with, and he feels closer to them than he does any cousins.
And I said after I got here and got acclimated to the sandstorms and the wind and so forth, I said, well, maybe 5 years. And 54 years later, I'm still here.
We decided we'd stay for 6 months. We didn't say which 6, and we're still here. But it's different, and it's a lovely place to live.
We were a very, very patriotic group of people, but it's a shame that the one sad thing is we had to give our land up. Somebody had to do that. So if it had not been our group, it would have been another town that would have been displaced, and the people would have gone through what we did. But the really sad part of the entire takeover was the fact that the pay wasn't ample to even go any place and buy anything else. My parents had to pay double the price for 2 acres and a little box-like house, no trees, 2 little tiny shrubs. I cried when I saw it. I just couldn't believe that, and they moved into Richland, as I mentioned before. But no, and we're still patriotic. We see a flag go by, we stand up. And I keep telling my grandchildren how important this is. And my children, and I'm sure that they realize I'm proud of that flag.
The day we came to Hanford town, the winds that blew a prefab down. We'll have those moments to remember. The pebbly walks, the blistering sun, the life in town was not all fun. We'll have those moments to remember. The wind it blew away back then, it filled our homes with dust and sand. We'll have those moments to remember. It blew so hard on one fine day, it blew my grass all far away. We'll have those moments to remember. The topsoil came, the topsoil went. It came airmail by heaven sent. We'll have those moments to remember. If we went out, we couldn't see our matching homes with no landmark trees. We'll have those moments to remember. The days did come, the days did go. Oh my, how our new town did grow. We'll have those moments to remember. Hanford workers were a mighty band. We helped build this project grand. We'll have those moments to remember. Recollections by Irene Maxwell.